Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and we're going to continue looking at international economics. We're going to continue our discussion of different forms of trade protection. We looked at tariffs. Now we'll look at another form of trade protection, which is a production subsidy. Okay, we'll be looking at a production subsidy. We're going to encourage domestic firms to increase their output or their supply so that we can reduce exports. For this example, we'll look at a primary commodity market such as wheat. We know that wheat has an inelastic demand and supply curve. We're going to be measuring quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. We have an upward domestic supply curve labeled SD1, supplying the domestic economy, and a downward sloping domestic demand curve labeled DD1, which is equal to our marginal benefit. And we'll see in a moment that since this economy is an importing nation, this demand curve will be part of the global demand in the global industry. So in a closed economy, right, just a little bit of review, in a closed economy where this domestic economy is not trading with other nations, the domestic supply and the domestic demand curve, where SD1 equals DD1, it provides the equilibrium price in the domestic economy at PE and the equilibrium quantity in the domestic economy at QE. That's where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. But then this economy decides to open up to world trade, and it will accept the world price. Okay, so let's say that the world price for wheat is set below this nation's domestic equilibrium price. So here we'll have a perfectly elastic world supply curve, and we're going to label this PW for world price, which is again going to be equal to the world price for wheat, which will also be equal to the world supply curve for wheat. As a result of the world price being less than the equilibrium price, we see that there's an increase in the quantity demanded for wheat by this domestic nation, increasing along the demand curve up to point B, and a decrease in the quantity supplied for wheat in this particular nation to point C. So we'll label those quantities here. We'll label this Q3, and you'll see why in a moment. And then we're going to label this point Q1, and you'll see. Okay, yep. We don't need to illustrate the equilibrium price, so we can go ahead and erase that. All right, so we're just eliminating this. It's not necessary to illustrate, but we just used it to highlight that since the domestic equilibrium price is greater than the world price, this economy will import. All right, so when they accept the world price at PW, we see that the quantity demanded at Q3, the quantity demanded at Q3 is greater than the quantity being supplied. Thus, this nation will import. All right, so imports will run from Q3 minus Q1. Right, it'll be everything that's being everything between this area. These will be imports coming into the nation, imports of wheat. Oops. Okay, so that may seem fine, but then the national government may see that perhaps this is an issue. Maybe there's a concern, a national security concern in terms of food security for this nation, that it's becoming increasingly dependent on other nations for its food supply. And thus they may want to encourage more domestic production so they're not so dependent on other nations for their food supply. All right, just trying to provide a potential reason. So we can apply a production subsidy, and we're going to assume it's a per unit production subsidy. So for each unit or each bushel or metric ton of wheat that's produced, farmers or firms will gain a subsidy from the government. So per unit production subsidy. And that will have the effect of causing a parallel shift outward in the supply curve. So let's go ahead and illustrate that. All right. So assuming that parallel shift, we'll see the supply curve shift outward, let's say to this point here, from SD1 to SD2, okay? Supply in the domestic economy, which would be equal to SD1 minus the subsidy, all right? So that would lead to increased output. So the quantity supplied will increase. Let's say, in this case, this is a little bit of an exaggerated example, from point C to point A. And at point A, that will set the new quantity being supplied into this domestic economy. All right, at Q2. All right, so firms, as a result of increasing their output, for each unit of output, they're going to get a subsidy. So they will maybe produce up to point A, subtract the subsidy so they can sell at the world price. All right. So we can also label this area here as price at world plus the subsidy. Right? So the distance between here and here is the value of the subsidy multiplied by the number of units being produced at Q2. Okay? Let's go ahead and label some areas to help us with our evaluation of the impact of this in terms of consumer and producer surplus, etc. So we'll label this area A, B, C, D, E, and F. All right, and here we have fully drawn a production subsidy graph. So I will analyze this and then we'll get into the evaluation. As can be seen, we have a domestic economy looking at the market for wheat. We're measuring quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. We have a downward domestic demand curve labeled DD1, which is equal to the marginal benefit. And we have an upward sloping supply curve in the domestic economy labeled SD1. Where SD1 equals DD1, it provides an equilibrium price at point A with an equilibrium quantity also at point A in this closed economy. But then this national economy decides to open up to world trade and they accept the world price at PW. The lower world price leads to an increase in the quantity demanded to point B or Q3 and a reduction in the quantity supplied by wheat producers from point A to point C or from quantity 2 to quantity 1. We notice that at Q3 the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Thus, this economy will import an amount of Q3 minus Q1. Those become imports into the nation. All right, and perhaps we can just emphasize that just slightly. All right, so we have imports before. Later, we're going to see imports after the subsidy. Okay, there we go. So Q3 minus Q1 represents the imported wheat coming into this particular nation. Perhaps this nation is concerned that they're becoming increasingly dependent on other nations for their wheat supply. This raises perhaps national security and food security concerns. Thus, the national government decides to apply a production subsidy to encourage more domestic wheat production. Assuming a per unit production subsidy, For each unit of wheat produced, perhaps for each metric ton, farmers get a fixed amount of subsidy. This leads to an increase in the quantity supplied from Q1 to Q2 along its supply curve from point C to point A. And at point A, farmers then subtract the subsidy so that they can sell at the world price at PW. Because of that increased output from Q1 to Q2, we see that imports have been reduced and are now the distance between Q3 minus Q2. So reduced imports into this nation. It is less reliant on other nations for its wheat supply. Okay? All right, great. So let's go ahead and evaluate this. Let's discuss a few points. First, let's talk about consumers. How are consumers impacted by the production subsidy? They are not impacted, right? Consumers are not impacted. Their consumer surplus, I'll just label this consumer surplus, before the production subsidy was equal to areas A, B, C, D, E. A plus B plus C plus D plus E. All right, this triangular area here. And the consumer surplus after the production subsidy is the same because consumers continue to pay a price of PW. All right, A plus B plus C plus D plus E. Consumers continue to pay before and after a price of PW. So consumers are not really affected, right? Perhaps they're not affected. They continue to buy at the lower world price. So overall, they are better off, right? Just to highlight that area here. This triangular area represents the consumer surplus that's not affected by the production subsidy before and after. So that's good. That's one benefit in comparison to tariffs, and later we'll see with quotas, that production subsidies does not affect the consumer surplus. All right, next let's look at producers. Okay, number two, how about domestic producers? All right, they are better off because producer surplus before the production subsidy was equal to area just F, equal to F. But then the production or the producer surplus after the production subsidy is now equal to areas F plus B. So there's more producer surplus as a result, right? Originally, it was just this triangular area, but then it increases along their supply curve. Remember, they're increasing output, and thus they have this level of producer surplus. So producers are definitely better off. And we can also mention the impact on total revenue. All right, total revenue before, I'll call that total revenue 1, was the price at world times Q1. But then with the production subsidy, total revenue 2 is PW plus subsidy times a greater level of output at Q2. So total revenue 2 is greater than total revenue 1, thus again demonstrating that producers are better off. Great. What about workers in the wheat industry working for producers? They are also better off. All right, number 3, workers in the domestic, let's say, wheat industry are also better off, right? Since producers are increasing output, producers have increased their output, quantity supplied has risen from Q1 to Q2, they will employ more factors of production such as labor. So there's more employment of labor due to the increased output. Okay, so workers also better off. Now let's look at the government as a stakeholder. Okay, I think that was the fourth point. The government, the national government, how do they do? They have to pay for the production subsidy, so they have to provide an amount of the spending by the government, the tax revenue being spent to provide subsidies to farmers, uh, tax revenue spent on the production subsidy is equal to areas B plus C. B plus C is being spent, right? This rectangular area is being spent by the government. B plus C, and that's also equal to PW plus subsidy minus PW, right, which is the height here, multiplied by the base of Q2, provides us, again, the value of this rectangular area. So the government is worse off because they incur an opportunity cost. They could have spent that tax revenue in providing some other public good or service. All right. Next, we'll look at foreign firms that produce wheat. They will be worse off. They will be exporting less. Okay. The next point, let's look at foreign firms. Foreign producers of wheat. They are worse off, all right? Their quantity supplied will be reduced as a result of this domestic nation importing less. Remember that this nation was originally importing from Q3 to Q1, but with the production subsidy, they're importing less from Q3 to Q2. So foreign producers will have a reduction in their quantity supplied, and that will also lead to more unemployment in their wheat industry in their particular nation. And that may cause that country to place pressure on this domestic nation for applying a production subsidy at the cost of the foreign nation having rising unemployment in their industry. And this, yes, all right, and that's I'll leave it at that point. Last point is allocative efficiency, global allocation of resources. So global allocation or global allocative efficiency is negatively impacted. Global allocative efficiency, all right, is negatively impacted. All right, we can see that a welfare loss has been generated, which is equal to area C. Okay, this triangular area here is the welfare loss. All right, and that represents increased output from an inefficient domestic producer. Welfare loss is generated because you have quantity supplied from a domestic firm that is productively inefficient. It's productively inefficient. Its costs of production are higher than foreign firms that have the comparative advantage. Resources are being allocated to these inefficient wheat producers, allowing them to increase their quantity of output. And we can state that at Q2, right, the marginal cost of production is going to be greater than the marginal benefit, right, at some point. So we can state, even though it's not illustrated fully in here, that the marginal costs of production are greater than the marginal benefit in the global economy, meaning that there's an over allocation of resources to these inefficient, these productively inefficient firms. They should not be increasing output. All right? And that's essentially it. We have analyzed a production subsidy and we have evaluated the production subsidy on various stakeholders within the economy. That's it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.